It's easiest for me to honor Luca by making this a personal talk about what he meant to me and what I have seen as his career. I can attest to many aspects of his career that have influenced me greatly. I was under Luca's mentorship for 7 years. I met him originally as a beginning graduate student, and he co-mentored me during that time, and then I spent 3 years as a postdoc with him. In 1965, Luca gave a talk on the work he had been doing with Anthony Edwards on human populations. An invited talk, and I happened to be at that meeting and hear him. I was greatly impressed and fascinated by the subject. My official major professor, Bill Stone, introduced me to Luca at that meeting. And I well remember the three of us sitting on the beds in a dorm room talking about what became my PhD thesis project on using domestic cattle and the extensive blood group data that were available as a model for how human populations might be related and a model for the mathematical methods for studying that. As I said, he helped mentor me through those 4 years of graduate studies, meeting with him when he was on sabbatical at Stanford and otherwise at various meetings. And then I moved to Pavia in 1969, spent a year and a half here. My wife and I then moved with him to Stanford when he moved there. During those first months in 1971 at Stanford, my wife Judith and I worked with Luca and Alba, proofing the pages of the book, The Genetics of Human Populations, that he and Walter Bodmer had finished the year before. Walter, all of the typos that were left are partly our fault. When we finished those proofs, Alba cooked a lobster dinner for the 4 of us. And we've been friends for the rest of their lives, though not always in close contact, with both Luca and Alba ever since. In somewhat later years, Luca had maintained his interest in human populations, but we attended a meeting in 1984 in Paris of researchers interested in the new field of human DNA. And flying back from that, we found ourselves seated next to each other on a flight from Paris to New York. It was clear from the meeting that the number of polymorphisms available for humans was no longer limited to blood groups and a few serum proteins, enzyme proteins. Clearly, there were going to be hundreds of DNA polymorphisms. Little did we know there would be, by now, millions of populations and specific populations that could be studied to illuminate human diversity and human evolution. And it was remarkable what he could pull from his brain and the reasons different populations were important to understand human genetics, human evolution, human diversity in general. Then, in the early 1980s, Luca invited my wife to Stanford to come set up a cell transformation laboratory to establish cell lines using the model that she had established in our lab at Yale. And we started working with him to establish cell lines on different human populations, since that was a necessity to have enough DNA. You couldn't get much out of one tube of blood, whereas now you can get more than enough from one tube of blood. So one of our first joint efforts was establishing cell lines on pygmy samples that were flown back from Africa to our labs. Both labs got samples very quickly. Those pygmy cell lines later became part of the Human Genome Diversity panel of cell lines. Luca's wide-ranging intellect was not really constrained by existing lines of scientific inquiry. You've already heard some examples of how he went off in different directions, pursuing important questions. His publications clearly document his important work and his productivity in a variety of different scientific areas. Just in his work that we wrote on genetics of various aspects of schizophrenia, and not just with me, but he did other work on schizophrenia. One paper on genetic drift in cattle out of my dissertation resulted with some mathematical embellishments thanks to Luca. DNA polymorphisms, with his lab set up at Stanford and with researchers like Anne Bocock, he found new DNA polymorphisms and used them very quickly in studying human populations. There's one paper on speech and language disorders, one paper with me on mapping of multiple endocrine neoplasia part 2, two actually, on Wilson's disease, and 4 on the theme of human genetic diversity. Judy and I interacted in many ways with Luca and Alba over the years, though less often in recent years. But we're happy we were able in 2015 to visit Luca in Milan, and we greatly value the copy of Perché la Scienza, autographed by Luca and Francesco. Thank you.